Welcome to the second part of Military Leadership Methods Transition to Leadership series. We're talking about do, be, and give. In this scenario, we're talking about be, being present, being around, being part of the organization that you're in, both up and down the chain. Now, the idea of being present, we talk about as kneecap to kneecap, which means you've got to sit down and get to know your people. If you want to get 100% out of your team, if you want to get the most out of the people working for you, you've got to know their story. One great story I like is about Nathan. We call him Nate. And we were driving north about day 6 of our invasion into Iraq. Now, Nate was a gunner, sitting up on top. He had the big turret with the big steel rim around the outside of it. And he would ride on top of this Humvee. And one night, in the dark, his vehicle got off the road. As it went off the road, it took a little jump. And as it took the jump, Nathan fell forward, slamming his forearm into the gun turret that he was standing in. Well, when he hit it so hard he actually fractured the bone. He broke his arm. And he didn't tell anybody about it for 2 days. Now, for 2 days, he was sick and he was feeling ill in the back. And finally, people figured out something was wrong, and they brought him to the corpsman. And the corpsman came to me. Now, our corpsman, Doc, he was a piece of work. This guy was 52 years old. He'd done 2 tours in Vietnam as an Army medic. He'd been captured in an oil rig as a medic working off the coast of Nigeria. He had perfect pitch. He had a photographic memory. He was a PhD. He was 5'2" and a semi-professional bodybuilder. He did powerlifting, and he was a professor at a university up in South Dakota. Doc was insane, and he comes to me one day with Nathan, and he's like, "Sir, we got a problem. Nate broke his arm." And they told me the story about how he got there. And they explained to me that he was starting to get a fever and he'd been puking in the back of the truck. But Nate's got tears in his eyes, and he's telling me, "You can't send me home." Now, if you're present, if you know your people, you have to know their backstory. And I'd sat kneecap to kneecap with Nate. I'd talked to him about his family. I'd talked to him about what he wanted to achieve and what he was there for and why he had joined the Marines in the first place. Nate's grandpa had been shot in the back and lived by a Japanese machine gun in World War II. Nate's dad had lost one eye in Vietnam to a grenade thrown by the Viet Cong. 6 days into the war, with a fracture on the front of his forearm, Nate could not go home and look his family in the eye, knowing that he'd only broken his arm. To get 100% out of Nate, he had to stay. He had to live through the rest of the deployment because he couldn't live with himself, knowing that he was only hurt a little and he had to go home. And so he was begging, with tears in his eyes, to stay. And my crazy doc wrapped him up and said he'd survive. I lamented about that decision because I wanted to connect with Nate and I understood his backstory. But because of his injuries, we were concerned about him. And for a day, he lay with his cast in the back of the truck, and he was sick and he was tired and he was useless. But in the end, it was a good decision. 3 days later, we were rolling through a town and we got ambushed. We got ambushed and one of our vehicles got stuck. And in the middle of that firefight, I was glad Nate was there because he saved my life. So sometimes getting to know your people really gets that 100% out of them. And if you take the time, kneecap to kneecap, if you remember that you've got to interface and understand their backstories, that's what drives them on to success. And what will set you apart as a leader, if you can lead because you know what's driving the people behind you. As we talk about being present, we have to talk about virtual presence being actual absence. As a leader, you have a critical role and responsibility to be where the action is. You have to go out to the job site. You have to be present when the crisis is happening because you can't just dial everything in. Text messaging or phoning or sending emails doesn't necessarily solve the problem. You have to put yourself in a place where you have the availability of yourself and your resources to solve a crisis when it happens. Now, pre-colonial war, Colonel Smith was stationed in Boston, Massachusetts, and he was tasked with going forward to the city of Concord, where they were going to take militia weapons and powder and collect it back up to stop the militia from being able to form a rebellion against them. And he marched his 300 troops, passed through Lexington into Concord. And when he got to Concord, there were 2 major bridges. He set up troops on one bridge to guard their return back from the farm fields, right? And he set up his troops on another bridge to guard a position so that they wouldn't be flanked, although they thought that there was absolutely no chance that that would happen from the militia forces. And then they marched their troops on further into the farm fields to the north to recover the militia weapons and the gunpowder. Well, they met resistance, a lot of resistance. The colonials had decided that they'd had enough, and this was the day they were going to make the stand. And from the ride of Paul Revere, they'd been warned plenty of time in advance. And so they came out. And in fact, they didn't find any gunpowder here because it had already been removed. And then they began to run backwards because they found themselves facing a force of 400 to 500 militia regulars. As they moved back onto the bridge, the fighting started. The troops on the bridge and the colonials engaged each other. And the British, for a moment, had an opportunity to defend their position. And they called down to Colonel Smith, who had stationed himself here at the second bridge. When they called him, he started moving his foot soldiers and himself. He was riding a horseback, but there was some problems. Colonel Smith had lost his military appearance and had allowed himself to get so large that he could not ride a horse as fast as the foot soldiers could march. And so they could only go as fast as their commander to reinforce the embattled troops up on the bridge at Concord. So as the regulars pulled back and the British troops were pushed off the bridge, he was unable to get critical reinforcements to the place and time they needed to be to stem the tide of the colonials turning the battle. And what happened is the British forces lost control of the bridge, and they lost their first fight against a colonial militia that should have run, that should have taken off. When he finally did get all his forces back together, they started the march back towards Boston. But emboldened by their victory at the bridge at Concord, mad about the massacre that had happened at Lexington, the entire route back into Boston, they were fraught with ambushes from every farmer, colonial, and rebel wannabe who was taking pot shots. And they suffered lots of casualties and the disgrace of losing to a field of farm workers as they worked their way back south. Being present is important, and virtual presence is actual absence. If you allow yourself to be so distracted or to not have the endurance to be where you're needed, you might find yourself not at the critical point when your team needs you the most. The other part of being present, is knowing how to take care of yourself too. When you get into a leadership position, you have to remember that although winners drive home in the dark, which means you put in the extra hours, you're the guy who's there first thing in the morning, you're the girl who leaves last at night, the important thing to remember is if you're doing that to yourself, what's the toll it's taking on you? Now, when we first launched the invasion, I was running a CAT team. It's a combined anti-armor team, and it meant we had 22 trucks, Humvees, with machine guns stacked on the top. And our job was to be like the cavalry. We would surround the rest of the unit as it traveled north. We'd go out in front and take reconnaissance. We'd provide security on the sides, and we'd make sure nobody fell behind. That process meant moving over 100 vehicles, tracking where everybody was, watching them on the map board. And for the first several days of our movement into Iraq, I was consumed looking at this map. I was consumed on the radio, talking to all the other commanders, making sure I knew where all the pieces were as we moved this delicate eggshell all the way forward. Right? And as we did that, I stopped eating and I stopped sleeping as much as I needed to. The problem is, if you don't take care of yourself, your endurance goes down. If your endurance goes down, your ability to make good, sound decisions goes down. So you have to be aware of how you're doing as well. Well, apparently I had taken it too far, because one day, as we were driving along after a break, my driver, Dan, reached over and he had opened a preheated meal. He'd cooked this thing up for me, put a spoon in it, tore the little lid off, and handed it over. And he said, "Hey, sir, just want to make sure you're still eating. You got to stay strong so that you can keep us all alive." He wanted to make sure I was making good decisions and not getting cranky or lost or irritable or have an inability to communicate because I hadn't taken care of myself. And so he was doing it for me. And by him watching out for me, it reminded me, sometimes in a leadership role, you got to slow down. Take time for you. Take time to set the pace correctly. Because if you don't do that, you could find yourself swamped with more work than you can manage, making bad decisions and treating people in a way that's not going to endear you or not move the organization forward. That concludes our second section in our three-part series on transition to leadership. Be present, be engaged. In our three-part series, do, be, and give.